Everybody thinks abortion is a dominant issue in the culture, except people who want to be silent about it in the pulpit. They're the only ones who don't see it that way, and the culture scratches its head and goes, wait a minute, if Christianity is really relevant, where's the voice on this?
Well, hello, everyone. Today, I got the opportunity to talk to my really good friend, mentor, Scott Klusendorf. Scott is the president of the Life Training Institute and the author of a fantastic book called The Case for Life. And Crossway just released a second edition. And unlike a lot of second editions, which are just clever redesigns maybe of a book, this book is substantially there's a lot more content in this. It's almost twice the size. Scott added a ton of helpful information in this book. But today we got to talk about why the church is so silent on this issue, abortion being one of the most important moral issues of our time. You would think that people could expect to go and gain insight on this issue at their local churches. But sadly, far too many churches are silent. Virtually all churches are silent on this issue. And that comes at great harm to men and women that are affected by abortion. So we talk about that, what can be done about that, and also dive into a bit of what are some of the best pro-choice arguments out there today and how we can engage them. I always learn from Scott, and I hope you will too during this conversation. Scott, I recently came across a Pew Research analysis that they found that of all the churches that posted sermons online, they found that only 4% of those sermons mentioned abortion. And of that 4%, only 1% of those sermons mentioned the word in more than one segment. So what it seems is that this is a topic that the church just isn't talking about in a meaningful way. So why is that the case? I mean, abortion is an important issue. I mean, to be very understated about it. I mean, what's at stake here is, roughly 1 million or so. It's either that roughly 1 million innocent children are dying every year through abortion, or women are being unfairly treated and being oppressed in a way that they ought not, and having freedom over their body taken away from them that ought not happen. So it's an important issue one way or the other. Silence doesn't seem to be a reasonable option for this. And when you think of the church, you think that that's a place where one should be able to go to get moral guidance on an issue so as important as abortion. So what's going on here, man? Why do so few churches engage this issue?
Well, if I had to reduce it down, Mike, to two root causes, it would be these. First root cause, a lot of us believe that it's on us to build a church. And we've developed a marketing approach to church growth that basically says, if I entertain people enough, if I have the right messaging, I'll draw a crowd and my church will be successful. And we forget that it's God who builds his church, and he does it through the faithful proclamation of the biblical word of God. We do it through proclaiming biblical truth, not by marketing to the masses. That's the first problem. The second is that we assume that our people can't handle tough truth. And we kind of assume we've got to give them a dumbed down approach, and they won't be able to handle it if we're straightforward with them. And both those assumptions are very damaging, and they compromise the preaching of the word of God in a way that can actually feed the sheep.
So just coming out swinging, man. You telling me that churches are more interested in simply growing some kind of franchised earthly kingdom, and they're afraid to preach the gospel? Is that what you're saying here?
In a way, but some of them are good guys. Some of them are just market driven. I get that. They've become so seeker friendly, they're believer worthless, as Greg Cunningham points out. But I'm talking here also about guys who do want to build the church legitimately. They're not merely personal kingdom builders, but they've bought into this notion that the way you get your church going the right way is to draw seekers, and you don't do anything that will turn seekers away, as if it's up to us to draw people. The Bible gives a different picture. God draws his sheep through the preaching of the Word of God. And I think a lot of church leaders also assume that their biblical worldview applies to everything but controversial issues like abortion. And they've bought the lie that this is a political issue and we don't want to get into politics, so we're not going to touch abortion with a 10-foot pole. And that too is a problematic view, because the biblical worldview, Mike, applies to all of life, not just the parts we like. It applies to everything. And to say, oh, the biblical worldview speaks to all of reality except this little thing over here that might become politicized, well, that's an errant view. By the way, all moral issues become politicized. Slavery became politicized. Segregation became politicized. Women voting became politicized. Spousal abuse became politicized. Today, sex trafficking is politicized, but that's no excuse to fail to bring a biblical worldview to those issues.
Yeah. And I think the unintended or the tragic consequence is that the church is viewed as irrelevant, that the gospel is irrelevant, that it doesn't have anything to say about the issues that matter most.
I think you put it real well in a quote of yours that I steal often and most of the time give you credit for, but not always. When you said that when the church does not speak up on abortion, it communicates one of two things. Either abortion is unforgivable or it's permissible, because there's no other options for explaining or interpreting the church silence on this. I know a lot of guys out there are good guys who want to preach, they want to be faithful, and there is a group out there that maybe hasn't said much on abortion. It's not that they're compromised. They don't know what to do. They don't even know what a pro-life church looks like. So I want to be careful that I don't paint too generally here with a broad brush and make it sound like there's nobody out there doing good work. When you were pastoring, you did great work on this issue, and I know other friends that are doing great work on it as well. And each of these guys, though, you and the guys I'm thinking of, had to come to a point where they asked this question: do I trust the Lord to protect his ministry through me when I preach difficult truths? And that's the gut check question for all church leaders. Do we trust the Lord to build his work through us rather than thinking it's our work and we better have the right marketing pitch?
Yeah. Well, I had the blessing of seeing it done. And I think a lot of pastors today, they've never seen it done before. I don't often like to publicly speak well of my friend Michael Moody.
No, you don't want to do that.
But he's a good friend, old friend and pastor. And I think he was the first pastor that I saw preach on abortion. And this was maybe 20 years ago. And I don't remember how he did it actually. But the fact that he was willing to engage the issue, and I saw firsthand what that looks like in a church, gave me some kind of a vision for its place in the church, and that you can address this issue and not lose on it or whatnot. You know, I think a lot of fear is, there's a lot of fear here for a lot of pastors. What am I going to lose? What is this going to cost me? And not that this is the reason to address abortion, but I've actually never had a bad experience talking about it, which that's probably a bit unique, or maybe not, but I've only had positive responses when I've spoke on abortion, whether it's preaching it, on a Sunday morning or being invited as a guest speaker and delivering a message to a high school. The response I get every single time is, one, it's a thank you. I've never heard anything like this before. Most people haven't heard a compelling pro-life case built on science, philosophy, and an understanding of how this fits in within a biblical worldview. But I also get somebody who comes up to me and says, hey, I've never told anybody this before.
Yeah.
And then they go on to share their experience with abortion, whether it's they had one, whether it was they paid for one, whether it was they pressured somebody to get one. And the fact that I spoke on it, or the host opened up an opportunity for their people to hear about this, it gave them permission to talk about it. And a tremendous amount of healing can come simply from the fact that you don't have to live in this closet of shame. it can come out into the open and you can talk about it and not be, not just be judged and condemned, but find good answers to one of the most important issues there is in life, and find a way to, just to find a way to deal with whatever your experience has been with it.
Yeah, and you're modeling exactly what we see Jesus doing in his conversation with the woman at the well. I mean, Jesus tells her the truth. You've had 5 husbands, and the one you're with now isn't your husband. And this woman gets so taken by him being a truth teller that she goes back to the village and hears her pitch for everybody to come hear Jesus. This man told me everything I ever did. Wow. He didn't paper over her problems. He was truthful about it. And it's funny what happens when we are truthful about abortion and we describe it as the shedding of innocent blood. We make the biblical case that abortion is the shedding of innocent blood. We make a case for the lives of the unborn, and then we point people to the solution for the shedding of innocent blood. My friend John Enzer has a great quote. He said, "Forgiveness for the shedding of innocent blood requires the shedding of innocent blood," meaning the shed innocent blood of our Savior, of course. So talking about abortion is a wonderful way to talk about the gospel, how Christ became a propitiation for our sin by putting forth himself as the offering for our sin, standing in our place condemned, bearing the wrath of God on our behalf. And it becomes a wonderful way when we speak truthfully on abortion to say, here's the fix, folks. We're not just giving you bad news. We're pointing you to the good news that's found in your Savior.
Yeah. Well, I've found that when I address this issue, it certainly does not turn people away from the gospel. In fact, I found often that it creates an opportunity to talk about the gospel in a meaningful way. And that's in part because they see that Christians and the Christian worldview has something to say about the most important issues in life.
That is so key. Yeah, because when we're silent on this issue, we're basically telling the culture Christianity has nothing intelligent to say on an issue that everybody in our culture admits is a big one. Whether you're pro-abortion or pro-life, everybody thinks abortion is a dominant issue in the culture, except people who want to be silent about it in the pulpit. They're the only ones who don't see it that way. And the culture scratches its head and goes, wait a minute. If Christianity is really relevant, where's the voice on this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I know your story. But tell the people listening and that will watch perhaps, what moved you? What motivated you to get into this line of work? In the category of, I shouldn't speak well of you publicly either, because you're a good friend of mine and I don't like doing it. I'd rather talk badly about you and have a snarky comment.
Isn't that what friends do?
That is, we keep each other humble, right?
Yeah.
But you're a fantastic speaker. You really are. You're one of the best at messaging that I know of. Your ability to take complicated ideas and put them into bite-sized, clear nuggets of truth is a really good skill. And I'm always impressed at how well you're able to articulate your messages. There's a lot of messages you could be out there talking about, maybe making even a lot more money or not having to deal with something so controversial. So why this issue? Why?
Well, honestly, it's because I saw abortion. In November of 1990, I was an associate pastor at a church in Southern California, Mike, as you know. And I had always been pro-life philosophically. There's never a time where I thought, oh, the pro-abortion side has better arguments. I thought their arguments were junk from the beginning. And I still think they're junk by and large, especially at the street level. But I wasn't doing anything about the issue. As Greg Cunningham points out, I was attitudinally opposed to abortion, but like so many others, I was not behaviorally opposed to it. Well, what shifted the needle was going to hear a talk that he gave at a church that was supposed to be well attended by hundreds of other pastors. A local pregnancy center had arranged for a pastor's breakfast, and Greg was going to be the speaker. And Greg is a very sharp guy, as you know, former member of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. He had written legislation there that cut off tax funding for abortion. And the local pregnancy center director, a beautiful gal by the name of Lois Honeycutt, who ironically went on to marry Greg later in life. But the breakfast I got invited to, she said, come hear this guy. You're going to like him. He's intelligent, thoughtful, very articulate. And Greg was all of those things. But that morning, it was me, 4 other guys and their wives, and that was it. But thankfully, Greg didn't let that deter him from delivering a very powerful message, which, as I was listening, I thought, I like this guy. He doesn't hurt the brain to listen to. But then he did something that fundamentally changed the direction of my life forever. He showed an 8-minute video depicting abortion. I had never seen abortion, and I sat there and I wept. I thought, I'm no different than the priest and the Levite who passed by on the other side of the road. I say I care about this issue, but I'm not lifting a stinking finger to stop it. And at that point, I knew things had changed. So I went home and I said to Stephanie, my wife, I think everything has just been upset in my apple cart. And I showed her that VHS tape he showed. VHS tapes were these rectangular things we used to show movies on, for anybody wondering what that is. That's our technology in 1990. But I showed her that tape and she said, I'm with you, whatever it is you're doing. And bottom line, 6 months later, with the blessing of my church, I resigned my associate pastor's position because I wanted to pursue helping pro-lifers make a case for life. And that's what got me going. Mike, I invited myself to speak everywhere and anywhere I could. If I knew your name, I'd call you up and say, can I come speak to your Sunday school class? Oh, you're a teacher at a local school. Can I come speak to your political science course? I just invited myself all over the place. And by the way, that's kind of a lost art today. A lot of pro-lifers want the platform of speaking, but they won't do the hard work of drumming up events. And we need to get back to being willing to do that, because we've got to ask ourselves a gut check question. Forgive me for preaching for a minute. I'm going off topic, but that's okay. I can do that after you just told the audience I'm articulate, bright, clear, and always on message.
Never wrong.
Yeah, a lot of us need to ask this question. Am I willing to do unpleasant work so that I can have an impact on saving lives? And I think a lot of us aren't willing to do that. We let our fears of speaking, our fears of asking for the event get in our way. And I think we need to ask, are any of the fears I might have about inviting myself to speak worth the price of children's lives that might have been saved had I been courageous enough to step up and ask? As Wayne Gretzky famously pointed out, you miss 100% of the shots you never take.
I want to come back to that in a minute, because I want to talk about the pro-life movement moving forward and what you're seeing. But before we get to that, I think seeing abortion. So it's interesting that's a huge part of your story. I think seeing abortion is just very important, and intellectual honesty, I think, requires us to look at it and see it for what it is. And there's a historical precedent, of course, in showing and using graphic images to awaken moral sensibilities, if you will. Of course, we experienced that here in the United States, the Civil Rights Movement and the Emmett Till story. But a part of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade has part of that story is the use of images. And I'll never forget this time you and I were over in England, and we spent an afternoon with the CBR UK folks, and they were, I think, outside of Parliament. I forget exactly where it was.
Outside number 10 Downing, along Whitehall there. Yep.
And they had with them these banners depicting abortion, showing dismembered preborn children, and they would engage in conversation with them. Anyhow, I was on the other side of the street, and there were these two guys that were just livid. They were sitting there going in and out of fits of rage and laughing, mocking what was happening. And so the guy that I was with from CBR UK, he goes up and he says, "Hey, you want to let me in on the joke?" And it was an off-putting way to kind of get involved in get the conversation going. And then these two guys just unleashed their fury on us about how it's just inappropriate, it's dishonest, it's like a gimmick, it's just improper, it's out of line. And I mean, just going on and on and on and on and on. So I, with a little smirk, to say, okay, so you don't think it works? Is that what you're saying? And he says, no. And he goes on and on again. And so then I asked him a question. I said, okay, so I hear you, but what would you do if you don't think that's if you don't think that's effective or right or fair? I said, what would you do to expose what you believe to be an injustice in society, a hidden injustice? What would you do? And I've had very few, I can't remember another time where I had somebody do like a 180 or a 360 this quickly, just turn about face. Because he goes, oh, that's a really good question, isn't it? Because I really like that. Oh, that makes me think. And then he starts telling back to me his own country's history of the use of images in awakening the nation's conscience to abolish slavery. And because at that time in England's history, the slave trade was mostly transatlantic, and they weren't seeing it anymore. And when they saw the images of the living conditions of slaves, it woke up the nation's conscience. So they saw really quickly, oh, I see what you're doing here. And it's not like they became pro-life on the spot, but they understood the importance of seeing a moral issue, not just hearing about a moral issue. And so I think that showing images is a very important part of the pro-life message, and something all people should see for themselves.
I agree. A funny story about that same event, because I was there too, only I was across the street at the other side of the display. And all along Whitehall there, people were walking by these large images of aborted fetuses. And one of the funniest things that happened is a group of middle school students came by, about 30 of them, with their teacher. And the teacher is yelling at these middle school students, all boys, don't look at the pictures. Well, I couldn't have paid him to do that. I mean, I would have paid him 30 pounds if he had said that. He did it for me for free. Of course, what do you think every one of those young men did? They looked at the pictures. And some people might be tempted to say, like that guy said to you, oh, these are just fake. And I love to ask people, okay, what do real abortion pictures look like? These are fake. All right, tell me what real ones look like. Well, of course, they have no answer. It's all a big smokescreen on their part. But it uncovers that we're in a culture that wants to cover up evil. And one of the problems with pro-lifers is we have a lot of pro-lifers that want to join Planned Parenthood in covering up the very evil that they claim to oppose. Why would you not want to show these pictures? I have not heard one good argument for not showing them, not one. And I've tried, I've looked. But why do we join Planned Parenthood in covering up the very evil that we're trying to expose? We should be those who pull the lid off this thing. To quote Ephesians chapter 5, we ought to expose deeds of darkness, not cover them up.
Yeah. Telling truth and being kind can go together. And I think
you can
that
be
is
kind. And by the way, when you show the pictures, you don't need heavy-handed rhetoric. The pictures do the heavy lifting for you.
Yeah. And it's not unkind either to cause pain. You think of, there's a number of analogies where an act of kindness might involve you doing something that is unpleasant for somebody else or causes a bit of pain. And addressing this issue, I guess what I want to say here is not speaking on this issue is unkind and it is unloving. This is one of the most important issues in the world today, and it must be spoken about. It has to be brought into the light and examined with reason, and done so in a respectful way. And to not do it is, it's unloving, it's harmful, it's unkind, and it is not what the followers of Jesus Christ should be about. So I think, to me anyhow, it's just very clear that there's no good reasons to remain silent on this issue, and tremendous amount of harm comes to people when the church is silent on this issue. Now, what we've done so far in this conversation is we've been operating, of course, on the assumption that the pro-life message position is the correct one. So before we get too carried away with, talking about why we need to talk about this, could you maybe give if you had to make the case for life, in a minute. Could you make that case? And then maybe we could build off that and look into this a little bit more.
Sure. Suppose a reporter shoves her mic in my face and says, "Why are you pro-life?" And I would want to give something that will resonate with her academic journal audience and yet still be pedestrian enough to be understood by anybody. I would say something like this: I am pro-life because it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. And the science of embryology is clear that from the earliest stages of development, you were a distinct, living, and whole human being. You weren't part of another human being like skin cells on the back of my hand. You were already a whole living member of the human family, even though you had yet to grow and develop. And you know what else? There's no essential difference between you, the embryo, and you, the adult, that justifies killing you back then. Differences of size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency are not good reasons for saying we could snuff you out then, but not now. Now, I think I got that done in maybe 45, 50 seconds, something like that. I didn't time it. But you'll notice I didn't cite any Bible verses, but I did convey biblical truth. I conveyed the truth that it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings, what the Bible calls the shedding of innocent blood. So I'm being faithful to Scripture, but I'm also presenting my case in a way that a non-church person can't simply dismiss as being, oh, that's just your private religious view. No, I made an argument. You've either got to show my argument is invalid or unsound. It won't do to just dismiss it as religious.
So on the science front, is it being argued that the unborn are not human? Like, you used to hear they're just a clump of cells. Is that argument still pervasive in society, or has the science of embryology and things like ultrasound pushed that out of people's minds?
It is still there, not as prevalent as it was in the 70s and early 80s when people tried to distort the science. As you rightly point out, that's become largely impossible. But we still, as pro-lifers, need to establish that, even though it may not be sufficient for the public to embrace our view, it's necessary. What we want to do is make the argument philosophically that we are the advocates of human equality, not the other side. It's the other side that says each and every human being does not have an equal right to life. It's our side that says they do. And we can illustrate that. We can make a philosophical case for it. We're not doing it in a vacuum. We're not just shouting conclusions. We're actually making a case for what we believe. And that's vital that we know how to do that.
Yeah. And so the science part, seems settled to me, but science can't inform you on the value of life per se. It can tell you what the unborn is, but not maybe what the unborn is worth. And that's why you have to, move into philosophy. And this is also why I think addressing abortion is so important, because abortion deals with just the most fundamental question of our time, which is, what does it mean to be human?
Yes.
Right? What makes humans valuable? And the Western world has experienced a lot of prosperity because they believe, mostly for the last, couple 100,000 years, progressively working this idea out, that human beings are valuable because of what they are, not the arbitrary characteristics that they possess. Abortion, though, the pro-choice argument, it fundamentally has to say, no, being human isn't enough.
That's right.
You only become valuable if you possess certain characteristics. Can you talk about why that idea is just really dangerous?
Yeah, we've got two rival worldviews going head to head right now in Western culture. The first view is what we call the endowment view, and that's the view you just spoke of that really liberated millions of human beings since the American Revolution even. And that is the idea that each and every human being has an equal right to life. They're endowed with this right to life in virtue of their humanity. Government doesn't grant those rights. Government's job is to recognize and protect those rights. And when pro-lifers argue that the unborn have a right to life, we need to be careful to define what we mean by that. We're not saying that the unborn should have every right that an adult has in terms of voting or driving or being a chair of logic at Harvard University or Princeton. No, what we're arguing is they have a natural right not to be unjustly killed in virtue of the kind of thing they are. You and I, when we visit the United Kingdom, which we've had the pleasure of doing on more than one occasion, do not have a right to vote in the next UK election. But we do have a right not to be gunned down in the middle of Trafalgar Square when we visit London. And that is not a right the British government grants us. It's a right we expect the British government to recognize and protect for anybody that's visiting the UK, as they should anywhere else in the world. That right not to be gunned down is what we call a natural right that springs from your nature as a human being. So when we say the unborn have a natural right to life, that their rights spring from their nature, that is the endowment view. We're valuable because of the kind of thing we are, not some function we perform. The rival view to that that's butting up against it right now, and more so now than even 10 years ago, is what we call the performance view of human value. And that view says being human is not enough. What matters is you have traits of personhood, which entails certain cognitive abilities that are arbitrarily selected as being value-giving. Traits like the ability to value your life, the ability to see yourself existing over time, self-awareness, consciousness, whatever thing they pick out as being selected there. It's arbitrary, and we can always ask the question, why is that trait value-giving and not something else? There's another view that springs off from this, and I'm sorry to be a little technical here, but I want to make sure our viewers understand what's going on. Those that embrace the performance view fall into one of two camps. There are those that I call the identity camp, and there's the group over here we call the rights camp. And they're not the same, though they all embrace the performance view. So on the performance view, those that buy into what we call the identity view, this would be Peter Singer, Michael Tooley, Jubilina Minerva, and others, they say that there's no you there until you have cognitive continuity, meaning you see yourself existing over time, you have memories connected through memory cycles, you can experience pain and pleasure. In other words, it's not only that you didn't have rights back then as an embryo, there was no you there to begin with. In fact, they say that applies to birth as well. On the other side of the performance view, again, still holding to a performance view, but it's a little different, are the rights-based people. These are people like David Boonin or Dean Stretton who argue you are identical to the embryo you once were. That was you back then, no doubt about it. However, you don't have the same right to life then as you do now as a cognitively functioning adult who has the appropriate brain architecture to support a desire to go on living. So both are performance view grounded, but they are different. And why that difference matters? Well, you need to know how to engage people who bring both types of arguments to the table.
Yeah. So what are the weaknesses in those views, the performance view? What's the weak spot? Why is it not the right view?
Well, let's start with the view that you aren't there, the identity view. Notice that view assumes body-self dualism, the belief that the real you has nothing to do with your body. Rather, the real you is your thoughts, your cognitive states that don't show up till much later. So the view ends up being rather counterintuitive. You end up saying things like, well, my brain showed up after my body did, or I existed after my body came to be. Well, that's strange. It's also strange in that you can say things like this. Well, have you ever hugged your mother? Not if body-self dualism is true, because you don't hug aims, desires, and cognitive states. You hug bodies. Behind me is a picture on the wall, and I'm assuming you can see it. When you look at that picture, Mike, two things are happening. Your eye is making physical contact with the object, but your brain is making sense of what you see. Your mind is making sense of it. That fits with the biblical view that we're a dynamic union of body and soul. We're not merely a body. We're not merely a soul. We are a dynamic union of body and soul. That makes sense because in looking at this picture, both mind and body are involved. The mind through the eye, the mind through making sense of what you see. But on body-self dualism, the only thing that matters in terms of identity is your cognitive state. Well, it's also going to lead to some very weird things on human equality. If it's true that cognitive states determine identity and value, those who have more of them have more identity and more human value and rights than those with less. And you can toss human equality on the ash heap of history. But I think there's an even more fundamental thing we should zero in on. We need to press our critics as to why the properties they've arbitrarily selected are value giving in the first place. And a lot of pro-lifers don't do this. What they do is the critic says, well, that embryo isn't even self-aware. And the pro-lifer will say, well, we can measure brain waves by week 10 on an electroencephalogram. Okay, that may be true, but it's a bad answer, and here's why. You just bought the premise that brain activity bestows value. Challenge it. How self-aware do I have to be not to be killed? And why is self-awareness value-giving and not having a belly button that points out rather than in? Make them defend their own premises. Don't let them get away with just assuming what they need to prove.
So a weakness would be, tell me if I'm tracking, is in part, it's an assumption that they're making, and they have to
an assertion, that an undefended premise,
right.
Yeah.
And they need to argue why those are value giving.
Yeah.
Would another weakness be that they prove too much? Meaning, if it is true that cognitive states are what give value, yes, it doesn't also, it applies to people other than those in the womb, those that are unconscious, for, people that are in a coma, or even if you're asleep, right? I mean, if you're not aware, if you don't have the cognitive faculties presently working such that you have desires and whatnot, it creates this problematic place where what gives you value, it's almost like you're slipping in and out of value over time. Am I saying that right, or am I making a mess of it with my words?
No, you're right on. And take David Boonin's argument that you've got to have the immediately exercisable ability for desires to have a right to life. And he says that doesn't happen until maybe week 28. Notice, though, this proves more than Boonin wants it to. First of all, newborns don't have desires. Well, how do we know that? They certainly have instincts and urges, but to have a desire, you have to have two other things present that aren't there in the newborn's mind. And that is this: you have to have recognition of your current state, and then you have to understand what could be a better state and desire it. For example, you recognize that right now you're cold and you desire to be warm. That's very different than simply having an instinct that I'm cold. You don't make sense of that cognitively until much later. But beyond that, a slave could be conditioned not to desire his freedom. Does that mean he's not entitled to it because he doesn't desire it? You could brainwash a slave where he desires no freedom, and he may not even desire his own life, but that doesn't mean it's okay to deprive him of it. I would also point out that on Boonin's view, as Francis Beckwith has pointed out, we could take a developing fetus and perform surgery on it before it has any desires. We could alter that part of the brain that controls desires. And then when the child is 5 years after it's been born, we kill that child and use his organs for harvesting to treat disease in people suffering from illness. And when the child is killed, he doesn't desire anything because we remove that part of the brain before he ever had desires. I think most of us would say that's wrong. Well, if it's wrong, what's doing the work at that point is not the desires, but the nature of the child that has been deprived of something he is owed by nature. In other words, you have to assume the endowment view of human value to argue that that would be wrong to treat the child that way. And that's what people like Boonin and others would have to do.
So maybe we're getting into one of the reasons why pastors don't speak on abortion. They go, this is why. I'm never going to master this issue. Endowment, performance, Boonin, Thule, Singer. Maybe Singer's a name people have heard. And maybe now we're getting into an issue of expertise that pastors are like, I will never have this. And if I open the door to this issue, I'm going to be overtaken by these kinds of questions. So on one hand, when you introduce this, Scott, the pro-life position, you roll out that syllogism that keeps this really clear that it is wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Abortion is the intentional killing of an innocent human being. Therefore, abortion is wrong. Science informs us of what the unborn is, and philosophy clarifies what the unborn is worth. Now, if you hang out there, and this view is perfectly in line with the biblical worldview and what the Bible has to say about human life and what you ought to do with it. If you keep it right there, it seems pretty simple. But then once you start getting into this and you start hearing about some of these objections, this becomes maybe a bit of well, this is why I can't do it. I'm going to do more harm than good if I open up and give people basically permission to talk about this. So what can pastors or just people listening do to grow in knowledge and competency? Is this fear, a legitimate fear? Is there something that we're missing about this? What resources are available? How do we get over that fear? That fear of, I don't know, I'm never going to know enough to say something about this.
Virtually every issue that you could preach from in Scripture can go deeper and more complex than your average sermon would allow. I mean, pastors have no trouble preaching on tithing, even though there's a vigorous debate among New Testament scholars about whether tithing is still biblical under the New Covenant. And you will see very sophisticated arguments back and forth with deep dives into the Hebrew and Greek language and debates over what is entailed with the New Covenant versus the Old. Is there continuation or non-continuation, partial continuation? I mean, you can get really deep, but that doesn't stop pastors from preaching on tithing. So on one hand, I think it's a bit of a cop-out to say this could get complex. I don't want to deal with it. But let's say a guy is there going, I really do want to be faithful to the Bible, but I want to make this as simple as possible. Okay, here's your biblical argument against abortion that does not require a PhD from Harvard or Fuller Seminary or anybody else out there, Princeton, to make. It's very straightforward. Here it is. Premise 1. The Bible teaches clearly that all humans have value because they bear the image of God. Genesis 1 teaches that in the Old Covenant. James 3 teaches it in the New. Premise 2. Because humans bear the image of God, the shedding of innocent blood, meaning the intentional killing of innocent human beings, is strictly forbidden. Exodus 23:7 teaches that. Proverbs 6:16-19 teaches that. Matthew 5:21 teaches that. All right, stop right there. Just take those two opening premises. All humans have value because they bear the image of God, and because they bear the image of God, the shedding of innocent blood is strictly forbidden. We only have to answer now one question, not a myriad of questions, just one. Are the unborn human? If they are, the commands against the shedding of innocent blood apply to them as they do everybody else. It's that simple. You don't need to go into Peter Singer if you don't want to. But it's helpful to know that background, but it's not necessary before you preach persuasively. And someone might say, well, nowhere does the Bible mention the word abortion, to which I want to snarkily reply, well, whoopee-doo. Does the Bible expressly say that you can't cut up your neighbor and use him for shark bait? No, it doesn't. But does that mean it's permissible? No, we can reason from scriptures to know that that's wrong. The Bible nowhere says gay bashing is wrong. Does that mean we can do it? And what I try to get guys to do is when people say to you, the Bible nowhere condemns abortion. People like John Pavlovitz love to say this, and others who think they're scoring a huge win, and they're making a very stupid argument, and I'm prepared to ridicule it because it's ridicule worthy. I would look at them and say, John, are you saying whatever the Bible does not expressly condemn, it allows? I mean, really, does it say in the Bible anywhere, thou shalt not gay bash? No, it does not. So for him to use that argument is really fallacious right off the top. I would also point out that when people say, well, okay, maybe the Bible doesn't mention abortion, but it also doesn't say the unborn are human. Now, I think we could probably make a case it does, but let's grant their premise that nowhere does the Bible say the unborn are human. We'll grant that, but here's what we do know. All humans have value because they bear the image of God. And we know that from the science of embryology, the unborn are human. Therefore, the commands against shedding innocent blood apply to the unborn as they do everyone else. The unborn, like you and I, are image bearers. Thus, they should not be intentionally killed without giving reason for that killing. That's your biblical case. And I think then this is another reason why I encourage pastors to show the abortion images, because they convey the truth at an intuitive level that gets past a lot of the academic excuses people love to throw up in front of the pro-life view.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Just because you don't know everything about a topic doesn't mean that you shouldn't say anything about it.
And you and I have both written things, resources that pastors can use that we're able to put out there. And I'm going to give a shameless plug, but in the new edition of my book, The Case for Life, the second edition, there's a whole section in there on what a pro-life church looks like, what a pro-life sermon ought to entail, and how a pro-life church can go about achieving 4 objectives that will help convey biblical truth to the culture.
Yeah, I do want to talk about your book, and maybe it's a talk for another day, a full treatment of that, because I'm real curious of what it's like to do a second edition. The first edition was very helpful, and it is the book that I recommend before any other on this issue. It's clear, it's concise, it engages with the academic arguments, but it makes it accessible for anybody to read it. And in so reading it, you become very equipped to make a case for life. The second edition is like, what's the comparison? It's like this much bigger. So what's new in the second edition? It's not, a lot of times people say, well, what is this? Is it just new branding so you can sell more books? That's clearly not the case if you just look at the two. So what's new and what's helpful in the second edition?
Well, first things first, Mike, if any publisher ever comes to you and says, I want you to do a second edition of the book, shoot yourself before you agree to do it. And I say that as a pro-life advocate, writing a second edition is harder than starting from scratch, because you have to puzzle piece. You do more than just write. You got to go, oh, wait a minute. What did I say previously? How do I merge that with what I'm now saying? And it's a mess. It'll drive you insane trying to keep track of all that. But I managed to get it done. And what's in the new book that I like best, it's actually simpler to read and understand than the first edition, even though it's thicker and contains more academic material. It starts very gradually and just builds premise upon premise until you get to the point where you're ready to dive into the deep stuff. So here's what's in the new edition that wasn't in the old. Number 1, there's a whole section on the rules of logic. How do we analyze arguments? How do we weigh whether an argument is good or bad? Because in a post-Roe culture, especially this very politicized culture that wants to cancel arguments rather than refute them, it's vitally important that pro-lifers know the ground rules of argument. What makes an argument good or bad? So that's right up front in the book. I start with the pro-life syllogism, lay out the ground rules for how it should be engaged. It's not going to work to call it religious. Arguments are true or false, valid or invalid. You can't beat an argument by dismissing it with a label. It won't work to say, how do you know I'm a man? Or to say, you're a man, you can't speak on this issue. Well, arguments don't have gender. People do. Arguments are judged on their merits, not the people making them. If Stalin argues that gravity exists and that corresponds to the world as it really is, Stalin has made a good argument, even though he's a bad dude. So even if I'm the worst person in the universe, I'm just awful. I hate women. I'm a misogynist. I really just want to see them die. I'm that bad. That could be true of me, and my pro-life argument could still be a good one because my argument stands or falls apart from who I am. Now, that's no excuse for us to be jerks, but it does establish the ground rules for engaging this argument. The other thing we do right out of the gate is define what it is to be pro-life. People are trying to change what it means to be pro-life. And I'm going to name names here because I was an English major. I call this citing my sources, right? You think of people like Russell Moore and others who want to move the pro-life movement away from dealing specifically with abortion to taking on all life issues. And their argument tends to be we are not legitimately and biblically pro-life unless we are womb to the tomb. We take on every pro-life issue, every human life issue with equal force, equal resources. And if we don't do that, if we don't become, quote, whole life rather than just pro-life, we're destroying our Christian witness and people will not be attracted to our cause. That's their argument. And I have a whole chapter in the book on why that argument is morally vacuous and why it will bankrupt the pro-life movement if we follow it. I mean, really, Mike, do we really think that people are going to suddenly stop their permissibility toward abortion if somehow we could just become more likable? This is nonsense. In fact, 100% of the time when I ask people, if pro-lifers do everything you demand, we take on the environment, we take on immigrants, we take on helping the poor, we take on inner city gun violence, we take on foster care, we do all of that. Will you then become pro-life on abortion? Mike, 100% of the time they say no. This is a big smokescreen, and it's really sad to me when people on our side of the issue buy the premises of our critics and say we've got to take this on. So I've made it
tactic based. Well, real quick, it's a tactic based in shame that our opponents use, and it's really tragic that our side has bought into it. And my wife, for example, when she years ago started to, the you're not pro-life unless you're whole life kind of movement really started to begin circulating. And my wife's response was like, so wait a minute, is the expectation that I equally devote my time and energy to an endless number of issues that pertain to humanity? And if I'm not doing that, that somehow I'm a bad or I'm phony? It's just meant to shame those that are pro-life in the classic sense into not acting because they become overwhelmed with all that there is to take on. And then what's the solution is you just take social media stances on all issues and functionally don't do anything. So it's a tactic of shame, and the Christians and those in the pro-life movement need to just get away as far away as they can from the you're not pro-life unless you're whole life idea.
That's exactly right. I mean, Mike, what possible issue is worse than the intentional killing of 1 million innocent human beings a year? Now, if you want to put that number in perspective, think about what's happened since Roe v. Wade in the almost 50 years since Roe v. Wade. We're talking 62 million human beings intentionally killed. That's Yankee Stadium filled 1,143 times over. What issue is worse than that? And what tends to happen, people on the left, they confuse contingent evils with what we call intrinsic evils. And let me define that difference. War is potentially wrong. It could be contingently wrong if it's an unjust war, if it's a war that involves just trying to get land for your own use and not involve real human justice issues. Yeah, it could be wrong, but it's not absolutely wrong. It's not intrinsically wrong. In fact, one could make an argument if you're the leader of a country and you don't defend your own people by going to war, you are wrong yourself. But abortion is not a contingent evil like that. It is always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. In the case of abortion, we not only foresee the death of innocent human beings, we intend it. A general in a just war can foresee the deaths of innocent human beings, but he doesn't intend them the way the abortionist does when he intentionally kills a child. So what political types love to do is confuse these two, and they try to get voters to say, well, the real pro-life candidate here is the Democrat that's pro-life on immigration, pro-life on refugees, pro-life on welfare spending for the poor. He's pro-life in that he's against war. He's the real pro-life advocate because he's only got one issue where he's not pro-life, abortion, but he's got 5 over here where he is. Therefore, if you really want to be pro-life, vote for this guy over here on the left. But that's confusing contingent with intrinsic evils. And what the left wants us to do, including every Democrat politician out there, is to vote for people who will protect an intrinsic evil, but oppose contingent ones. And they're not the same. They're different categories.
Well, I think going back to one of these earlier points of starting to feel overwhelmed to take on this issue, I do think your book is incredibly helpful. So for the person listening or the pastor listening that's worried about, if I open the door on this and I get asked a ton of these questions, what do I say? Your book is a phenomenal resource.
They'll be ready to answer. And, other new parts of the book very quickly, there's a whole section in there on the worldviews driving the abortion debate. How does philosophical naturalism inform the debate? How does postmodernism inform the debate? And the new kid on the block, how does wokeness, or what we call critical theory, inform the debate? If you aren't aware of the underlying worldviews people bring to the table, you could end up talking right past them. So that's in there. And then a survey, a part that I'm really happy about, because this was the hardest part, but I felt it was necessary. I work through the top 5 thinkers on the other side. So Peter Singer, Michael Tooley, Kate Greasley, who's a new kid on the block, David Boonin, Jubilini, and Minerva. And I go through their arguments. These are the academic heavyweights. And I give the reader a survey of what each is arguing and some pointers on how we might respond. It's not a deep dive the way you'd get in a full-blown position academic paper, but it's enough to give the reader a working knowledge of these ideas so that when you hear them out in the culture and on the street, you know what their genesis is. You know where they came from.
Yeah, well, there's a ton of value in that initiation kind of level of reading or in writing, and just knowing who these players are, what are their arguments, and even through using like your bibliography and footnotes, places for people to go to study even further. Now that you've introduced these ideas, man, our time's running out, and I'm really curious about the best pro-choice arguments out there, and we don't have time for a deep dive on that. But are there any players out there who you think are really worthy adversaries, if it's fair to put it like that? And
yes,
what are their arguments
you raised
in a
that
nutshell?
question, Mike, because there are some pro-lifers that make very foolish statements like everybody on the other side is just a stupid baby killer. That is not a helpful way to approach this. There are thoughtful people who can have very bad arguments, but we should not be dismissive of what they're arguing. Kate Greasley, for example, is very winsome, very attractive young woman in Oxford, England, who is putting forth an argument in defense of abortion that I'm not persuaded by, and I deal with her in the book. But it would be foolish to just dismiss her as being a weak-minded, pro-abort baby killer. We got to do better than just call names. That's what our opponents do. We don't want to do that. Kate Greasley, for example, does a wonderful job taking down the argument of Judith Jarvis Thompson. Judith Jarvis Thompson is the one who argued that even if abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being, even if it kills a person, abortion is still justified because a woman can't be forced to use her body to sustain the life of another human being. She can withhold that support if she wants to. And she uses the famous violinist argument, which we won't go into here, but a lot of your listeners have heard. Well, Greasley destroys that argument. In fact, she does an unbelievably good job about it. And what's funny about her book, the first half of her book defending abortion absolutely obliterates a lot of people on her side of the issue who are making very shoddy arguments. And it's always helpful when you're dealing with a hostile crowd to hold up one of their own and say, your own person is refuting this. That's very helpful. Her argument is basically this, that we should view personhood as the dynamic issue in this debate. It all comes down to, are the unborn persons? And she basically argues in what she calls a range view of personhood, which I'll only unpack very shortly here, that once you are born, you are in the range of personhood. And the fact that you develop further is irrelevant. Just like New Jersey and Hoboken, just like Princeton and Hoboken are both in New Jersey, and we don't say one is more in New Jersey than the other, even though it's true geographically that Hoboken is barely in New Jersey and Princeton's right dead in the center of the state. both are equally in New Jersey. And her point is that once you're born, we don't need to worry about the fact you gradually continue to develop after that. You're safely in the range of personhood, and therefore you now have a right to life. Now, that argument has problems. We won't unpack it here. I do it in the book. But that's a sophisticated argument. You can't just ridicule. You got to do the work of pointing out where it goes south.
Yeah. And I think that is, if it hasn't been stated explicitly in our talk, you and I both advocate for an approach to engaging this issue that is built upon kindness, truth, respect, not name calling, not taking cheap shots, not overstating your claim, making an honest claim, making an honest argument, and to respect people with, in how you engage this issue. Last thing, because I know we got things we got to get onto. And I'm surprised, by the way, I haven't had a kid barge through this door. It's a holiday today and our kids are home and I got 5 of them and I haven't heard an argument yet. And one of them hasn't bounded through the door. So I'm really curious what I'm
killed.
I don't know what's going to happen when I open that door behind me and what I'm going to find. But maybe just a parting idea here. What would you hope to see? Like, what's your vision of a pro-life church, and what would you hope to see the church do? Throughout a month that focuses on the sanctity of life, but year round, what does a pro-life church look like? What's your vision there?
Yeah, I'd like to see churches do 4 things. Number 1, preach, teach, and counsel a biblical view of human value, namely that we are not valuable for what we do at a performance level in terms of cognitive function. We're valuable because of whose image we bear. And we've already made that argument. Secondly, I want them to preach, teach, counsel, and show that abortion is a sin that intentionally kills an innocent human being, represents the shedding of innocent blood that we see in Scripture. Thirdly, and this is key, even churches that do a good job on those first 2 points, they preach a biblical view of human value and they convey the truth about abortion, often don't go to the third step, which is to equip their people to engage unchurched people on this issue. You and I both teach at Summit Ministry, and what we have found out at Summit is that students coming for the 2-week conferences throughout the summer, they get there, even though they're coming from some of the finest churches in the country, when we survey them and say, how many of you have heard a pro-life apologetics presentation at your church aimed at equipping you to defend the pro-life view in a secular world? Very few hands go up. We might get 8 hands out of 200 people present. That's a dismal statistic, and it explains why we're losing. And then fourthly, we need to bring gospel-centered preaching to bear for people who've been wounded by abortion. We use the bad news of abortion to point them to the Savior who brings healing.
Yeah.
That's what a pro-life church looks like.
Well, and we are here to help those that want to do something about this. The Life Training Institute and Scott, hit them up. If you need speakers, if you need resources, reach out to them. Reach out to me and the folks at Apologetics Inc. We exist to equip the church to make a winsome case for the Christian worldview, and on this issue, make a case for life. And so we're here to help. We're very accessible. Shoot us an email, hit us up, find us on social media, and let us come alongside you and together proclaim the hope that is in the gospel. Scott, we could go on, and thanks for your time, man, and look forward to when we get to hang out here, hopefully soon.
Thanks, Mike. You're doing phenomenal work, and it's a joy to get to work with you, and we'll have some more things to say about some future collaborations we got in the works right now that I'm very excited about. Can't think of a finer guy I'd rather be in the trenches with.
You're too kind. Thanks, man.
Thank you.